Good morning, everyone. My name is Sadie Colcord, and I would like to warmly welcome you all to today's CEDAS Academy webinar, Addressing Climate Change Through Resilient Development. I work in municipal services with the Connecticut Economic Resource Center, and I'm also the co-chair of the Programs Committee for the Connecticut Economic Development Association, or CEDAS. This webinar is part of the 2019 Confluence Series, which represents a partnership between CEDAS and the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association, focused on addressing issues that require collaboration between land use and community planners and economic developers. A special thanks to CCAPA for working with us to make this program possible. I'd also like to thank my CEDAS Programs Committee co-chair, Kristen Gorski, and our incredibly hardworking member, Laura Brown, for making this webinar series and all CEDAS's awesome programs possible. The Programs Committee develops educational events and seminars for CEDAS members and the broader economic development community in Connecticut. I'd like to mention that the Programs Committee is always seeking new members, so if you have an interest in joining us or learning more, please be in touch. Okay, so before we get started, some housekeeping logistics. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent out to you all after the presentation later today. We will include a program evaluation survey in that email, so please take it if you have a few minutes. Also note that your audio has been muted, and I've provided the call-in number on the screen should you need to switch at any time to phone audio. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, but if you have questions for our panelists as they are presenting, please feel free to send them via the question box on your webinar screen. We will be monitoring it for the questions, which we'll then pose to the presenters during the Q&A. Also, if you're looking to get CM credits from this webinar, when you close your webinar browser immediately after the webinar ends, you'll be directed to a 2-question survey asking for your information and whether you're looking to receive the credits. So please make sure you fill that out. We will give another reminder at the end of the webinar, but don't forget to do this. So now I'd like to turn it over to the CEDAS President, Garrett Sheehan, to provide a quick welcome on behalf of CEDAS. Garrett?
Thanks, Sadie. I appreciate it. And thank you to CCAPA. We're so excited that we can partner on this program. One of the things that we try to do at CEDAS is provide opportunities for our members to continue to learn so that they can lead their communities in economic development and land use as well. This is another great opportunity. We just finished up last week a program on bioscience. Our webinar series provides great information. So we're so happy that so many of you could join us today, and thank you again for CCAPA for being a great partner.
Thanks so much, Garrett. Mike Piscatelli, the president of the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association, is also here with us. Mike, would you like to say a few words on behalf of CCAPA?
Sure. Good morning, and thank all of you. Hope everyone had a very nice holiday weekend. My name is Michael Piscatelli. On behalf of the City of New Haven, I'm also the current president of the Connecticut chapter of APA. And I wish to start out by acknowledging the extra efforts Sadie, Laura Brown, as well as Jose Geiner, a member both of CEDAS and CCAPA, to everyone who's participated in the webinar series to date. These collaborations are extremely important for us and very much in keeping with our chapter's Start with Planning policy platform. We are really striving to provide the type of technical assistance that will help our planners plan. For those of you on the CEDAS or the economic development side who may be less familiar with our core values on the planning side, they include social justice and environmental stewardship, being mindful of the long-range consequences of our decisions, and perhaps most important for today's webinar, the interrelatedness of decisions, looking at economic development, resiliency, transportation. We have a very important focus on equity and integrating all of that into sound public policy. Let me start by saying we should not lose sight of a core need, which is to dramatically reduce carbon emissions, and that needs to be at the forefront of our climate change strategy overall. And of course, that being said, we are seeing the impacts already, and that's not only in the shoreline communities. We have many folks on our City of New Haven team on the call today as we move forward both with resiliency. These are efforts to protect jobs and to create new areas for economic growth, such as the Long Wharf in New Haven, and also to improve our policies, regulations, and design efforts to reflect this changing landscape. These efforts start from knowledge, and you have some of the very best people and expert professionals in our state with Alex, Yaprak, and Robert, who will lead today's discussion. And I look forward to hearing their insights and then discussing ways we can put their thoughts into action, both with our members on the call and then at the next chapter meeting, which will be coming up on June 14th at the Mark Twain House. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it, and enjoy the call today.
Thank you, Mike. So let's turn to today's webinar. In the next 45 minutes or so, we hope you will learn about the anticipated impact of climate change on infrastructure, transportation, and housing, as well as best practices in designing new development for climate resiliency. You will also hear about real-life examples of communities throughout the Northeast that are successfully implementing resilient development projects. We're so pleased to welcome three fantastic presenters today. Yaprak Onat is the Assistant Director of Research for the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, also called CIRCA. She coordinates the planning, development, design, implementation, and evaluation of flood risk mitigation projects for coastal resilience and engages in workshops and training to improve science communication for capacity building activities. Her goal is to increase the adaptive capacity of coastal regions via hazard management strategies to develop the most optimal approaches for the sustainability of coastal communities. Her outreach interests focus on improving the learning environment and teaching techniques for STEM students. Yaprak holds a PhD in Ocean and Resources Engineering from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and MS from Ocean and Resources Engineering from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and Civil Engineering from Middle East Technical University. Alex Felsen is the Deputy Executive Director and Director of Resilience Design, also at the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. He plays a key role in developing the state's resiliency planning, including working on a 4-year science-based risk assessment and broad consultation planning initiative to produce a resilience framework for Connecticut. Dr. Felsen also serves as Associate Research Scientist in UConn's Department of Marine Sciences. He holds a PhD in Ecology and Evolution from Rutgers University, an MLA from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, and an MS in Land Resources from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Finally, Rob Freudenberg is Vice President of the Regional Planning Association's Energy and Environmental Programs, leading the organization's initiatives in areas including climate mitigation and adaptation, open space conservation and park development, and water resource management. He oversees a comprehensive program of projects and policies to improve public health, quality of life, sustainable development, and climate resilience in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut metropolitan area. Rob holds a Master's of Public Administration and Environmental Science and Policy from the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and a Bachelor's in Environmental Biology from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So without further delay, I will turn the presentation over to Yaprak. Give me 1 second. Okay. Yaprak, take it away.
Thank you, Sadie. So first, setting the stage, I want to mention about what the climate change variability in local scale for our Connecticut and how we are going to actually identify these impacts with vulnerability assessment, and also what kind of cost and economic problems that can be associated by the sea level rise too. All right. So the first impact that we can talk about is the temperature projections. CIRCA, actually founded with UConn faculty, Dr. Angie, Seth, and Yuling Wang, the temperature projection estimations. The graph that you see here has the black line. It's actually the recorded average temperatures for each year. And you can see that after the 1950s, it shows an increase. When we do these projections, the estimates of the climate change, we see that by mid-century, it's going to change 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and the end of the century, it's going to change by 8 degrees Fahrenheit. You may see that this may not be very high, but it is actually, since affecting the annual temperature changes, it's going to make our summers and falls hotter. And since we have higher temperatures in years, we will see more heat waves and fewer frost days, which is going to affect our growing season. Consequentially, we have a precipitation changes that we see the annual precipitation is going to increase, especially in winter and spring, which can cause more severe flood risks. And the summer is going to have a less water availability, so we have a chance to face more drought season during the summertime. When we look at the sea level rise projections, the graph here gives that the blue line represents all the tide gauge measurements taken with the upper percentile level, and the other purple, orange, and yellow line represents the sea level rise projections with the climate change impact. Dr. Jim O'Donnell from CIRCA and Yukon Marine Sciences projected these scenarios for the Connecticut shoreline. What you see here in 2100, between the most conservative, not if there is no climate change, versus the very high extreme estimates, there's almost like a 5 feet difference, which is a very high uncertainty. But if we come to 2050, you see from the highest line and the lowest line, the changes are almost about like 25 inches. That's why Connecticut accepted, and Dr. O'Donnell found that the 20 inches by 2050 is a good planning threshold for Connecticut. And since with the future, we have the uncertainty needs to be reduced. This scientific analysis needs to be repeated every 10 years, and it is actually accepted as a Senate bill. If you want to talk more about the sea level rise projections and how it is going to affect, because you may think that, okay, 20 inches by 2050 may not be that much, but let's see how it is going to affect us. So the left graph that you see for New London, we have the daily sea level anormality, and all these peaks that you see is the high storm impact. And the left we have the return interval graph. It's a different representation. So the highest peak that you see is going to represent the highest box in here. The second peak is going to represent the second box. Third peak, third box. So it's going to go like that. So everyday events that you see in the water levels are going to be in more frequent compared to very catastrophic events. And if we draw a best fit line to this return interval graph, we see that we have a lot of data here, right, in the 10 years. But we have a scattered bit data and estimations above the 10 years, because the most catastrophic events do not happen that frequently. So when we add this, like 10-year event, the flood level is 1.4 meters, which is approximately like 55 inches. So let's add the 20 inch by 2050, which carries this parallel line above by 20 inches. So where do we see that 1.4 now? It is actually here. So it is between 1, 2, 3. It's between the year 2 and 3. So the frequency that you're going to see these events, like a 10-year flood, is going to happen more frequently, almost like every 2.5 years. And also, we will see that the flood height for extreme floods are going to increase the levels. So you need to not only just plan for the height and also the frequency change of these events. So when we think about these vulnerability assessments, we understand the vulnerability can impact in physical, social, economic, and environmental impacts. And one of the crucial features of the sea level rise that the impacts vary along the coast with coastal geomorphology type, climate, ecology, socioeconomic, and land use characteristics and the coastal management policies. So the impacts hide important regional differences. Therefore, the vulnerability assessment needs to be done in site-specific, scale-dependent, multidimensional, and changing over time approach to match with the dynamic process. So when we look at the vulnerability equation, it is mainly defined by 3 components. One is the exposure, the magnitude and the rate of the climate change variations. The second one is the sensitivity, the degree of which the system could be affected by the climate change stress. And the last one is the adaptive capacity, which is the ability of the system to adjust or cope with the climate change impact. So all of these potential consequences of the climate change on natural or human systems can be quantified in terms of potential or residual impacts and risks. So the main aim of the vulnerability assessment is to identify vulnerable receptors in the region and localize vulnerable hotspot areas. So the assessment is going to help us with relative vulnerability maps that's going to provide, and also allow us to prioritize more vulnerable areas compared to the other target regions, and different climate change effects, like how it's going to affect the examined region, and support the identification of the suitable areas for settlements, infrastructures, and economic activities. When we look at the cost of the sea level rise, we see that the impacts can be the increase of erosion areas, increase of inundation probability, submergence, coastal wetland loss, and the change, and salinization of some of the coastal rivers. So these result in physical changes and corresponding monetary costs, such as land loss costs, migration costs, sea flood costs, and salinization costs. So the direct cost approach, when we are talking in sea level rise, evaluate cost multiplying the quantity loss by the unitary price of the item lost or the displacement. The issue here is to consider explicitly the goods and the factors substitution mechanisms triggered by changes, and in relative prices corresponding to the initial land and property loss, or the investment in the coastal protection, or their final effects on the welfare. So we have to consider in terms of the adaptation, coastal residual damage, and net benefit of the adaptation cost. When we look at that, in addition to the direct cost, we can have actually a wider economic impact of sea level rise. Let's consider that we have a coastal land is lost due to sea level rise. The market rent of that remaining land will increase, and thereby increasing the income of landowners. Economic activities which directly or indirectly use that land will be characterized by higher production costs. This entails changes in relative competitiveness of industries and regions, and changes in terms of trade and in the whole structure of the economy. Eventually, economic effects of the sea level rise will also be felt in regions and sectors that are not directly affected by the resource loss. So when we see this, the cost of the sea level rise has negative economic impacts, and for the Connecticut, which has a higher exposure vulnerability assessed on the eastern seaboard, can face more due to the coastal storms. The impact of the sea level rise is not only just shown in coastal lands, and it can also affect the inland too. And in order to define which areas under which receptors, meaning in transportation, housing, or settlement impacting, CIRCA is conducted a coastal vulnerability assessment region-wide. And another thing, according to that vulnerability assessment, we'll be able to see the adaptation is going to be crucial to keep the negative impacts of the sea level rise at more acceptable level. If you would like to learn more about the sea level rise science and also our vulnerability assessment, you can visit our website resilientconnecticut.ucon.edu. Now, I want to give the word to our Deputy Executive Director and Director of Resilience Design, Alex Felsen.
Thank you very much, Yaprak. Okay, so my name is Alex Felsen. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for CIRCA, and I'm going to talk today a bit about resilient design strategies. And you can look at some of these examples and think about the complexity of dealing with housing development in the floodplain, thinking about transportation systems and watersheds, and anticipated future flood risks for homeowners in wetland areas. There's a lot of complexity to the negotiation strategies, and the issue of flood risk, storm surge are factors that are make it complicated and in terms of negotiating with homeowners at the municipal scale. So next slide. In Connecticut, it's somewhat unique because the area along the coast really exists as patches of risk. So if you look at the bottom three images on the left of the geologic map showing the historic plate tectonics where these north-south plates came together and created these north-south ridge lines. You have the glaciers that then, put large ice sheets over the area, and when they melted, they created the terminal moraine, which is in red, showing Long Island, and it also created Lake Connecticut and deposited these low-lying patches of sand and soil. So you basically, in Connecticut, have ridge lines with patches of risk that are these low deltoidic areas. So you have homeowners who built on high ground next to homeowners who are in low ground, which creates an interesting circumstance. Next slide. That zone, partly because of the construction of Metro North and 95, creates essentially an investment zone or investment corridor. It's a transportation corridor that crosses over a number of waterways and rivers. And there's this question for Connecticut about land use strategies and how to, from a resiliency perspective, how to deal with upland watersheds and neighborhoods. There's the issue of highways and the impact of highways on hydrologic dynamics, but also on issues of egress and access. There's conservation zones and remnant parcels and habitats that we're considering. And there's the role of the train stations as hubs along the Connecticut coast. Next slide. So this idea of the Connecticut coast is really fundamental to our investment strategies and is part of the state agency's principles of smart growth. If you look at this plan here, you can see the green areas are areas below the 11 to 67% below the poverty level. So there are pockets of low to moderate income neighborhoods along the coast, which is common. And the blue dots are existing rail stations. So you can imagine the importance of thinking about this infrastructure investment running parallel to the shoreline that caters to a number of low to moderate income populations, as well as wealthy communities. So there's kind of a hybrid circumstance. And the idea with smart growth is to integrate planning or investment strategies that coordinate the tax, transportation, housing, environmental, and economic development policies at the state, regional, and local level. So these smart growth initiatives have to face the issue of sea level rise and storm surge as a fundamental impact on investment. Next slide. So most people on the call probably know about the transit-oriented development framework. You develop residential, commercial, and employment centers within a quarter to a half acre of public transportation facilities like a rail or bus line. And they are intended to meet transit supportive standards for land uses, as well as built environment densities and walkable environments. So you often create a mixed use development strategy, and you incentivize land use change. And in Connecticut, the TOD concept is something that has been integrated or sought after in a number of communities. It's a very common agenda. We took that idea, next slide, and recrafted it for resiliency. So we took the TOD concept, turned it into a corridor instead of a circle, essentially around the transit hub that connects the uplands with low-lying communities. It's an investment strategy that the state is moving forward and applied for through the HUD National Disaster Resilience Grant recently. And basically, what it's useful as a framework for establishing egress routes at the municipal scale, but also for investing in raising road strategies to connect to critical facilities. And it takes advantage of the Connecticut coastline where you have high ridge lines as well as pockets of low-lying areas. So the Resilience Corridor concept is a design framework that builds on the TOD approach and integrates economic development with risk reduction. Next slide. So here's an example of the Resilience Corridor approach in Bridgeport, where you identify certain roads that run perpendicular to the coast that, in the case on the right, you can see in red illustrates the commercial development area. So in many cases, these resilience corridors already function as commercial strips. Essentially, you identify these resilience corridors, these areas of high ground, and look at ways in which they connect down to the coast. And you think about strategic investment strategies that can support the local communities, that can facilitate things like investment in water mains, dealing with things like debris management and other kinds of emergency management issues, resilience centers, as well as public housing, and establishing dry egress, and frame it around the idea of a TOD approach. It also allows the state to have targeted investment without necessarily investing in repetitive flood loss homes that are low-lying that will face risk over time. Next slide. Okay, so there we go. So that brings me to share the image, the kind of iconic image that we've been developing as our resilience corridor icon for the HUD National Disaster Resilience Competition, which is a competition that we participated in at the state level with multiple agencies, and it's linked to the State Agency Fostering Resilience, or the SAFER Council, which is a interagency program or initiative at the state level that is focusing on resiliency planning. And you can see a number of the people that are involved in this program. And from this diagram, you can tell that we have this parallel infrastructure investment on 95 in the train station. We have existing business development in the transit hubs, and we have critical facilities and repetitive flood loss homes and neighborhoods along the coast. So the idea of investing in the resilience corridor has multiple benefits. Next slide. Okay, so as we got involved in this role, the state was awarded $54 million as part of the HUD National Disaster Resilience Grant, and so we've been moving forward with a team to develop resilience planning. And we recognized early on that this approach requires different scales of action. So we're looking from the state and regional analysis perspective. We're developing regional modeling and engagement strategies. We're thinking about project scale and municipal engagement. And we're actually establishing technical and field research that can feed into informing smart decisions at the site scale. Next slide. And our approach builds on a number of state frameworks around economic development and planning, including the conservation development policies for the Plan for Connecticut 2013 to 2018, the growth management principle around redeveloping and revitalizing regional centers and areas with existing or currently planned physical infrastructure. When you look at this map and you look at the sewer service area, you can recognize the importance of reinvesting in areas along the coast, given the amount of infrastructure investment that exists. Next slide. There's also a framework, growth management principle 3, to concentrate development around transportation nodes and along major transportation corridors to support the viability of transportation options. So clearly the resilience corridor framework builds on this agenda. Next slide. So I mentioned this kind of multi-pronged approach or multi-scaled approach that we are taking. This is partly because we're recognizing that innovative resilience planning occurs not just at the site scale or the individual property level, but really occurs at the scales of the watershed and at the scale of infrastructure systems. And it occurs over time with planning from near to long-term planning, making sure that we invest in strategies in the near term that facilitate successful long-term adaptation moves and don't push us further into costly changes that we have to do in the future. So on the left, just looking at the CSO, the combined sewer outfall issues that Bridgeport faces, that New Haven faces, and the issue of dealing with investment strategies to reduce combined sewer outfalls and the impact that the watershed has on those systems, or in the middle, the land use negotiations around the transportation system within the watershed. And on the right, looking at West Haven, Oldfield Creek's flood risk over time and thinking about road raising policies. Next slide. One thing to recognize is that you can work at the watershed scale where you have a whole series of complex layering factors, including ecological, social, economic, political, infrastructural, and there's a complexity to watershed scale planning. And then when you zoom in on the right, and on the left is the Quinnipiac, on the right is a zoomed in area of the Quinnipiac, which is a large marsh complex in North Haven with big box development around it. You start to recognize the complexity exists at the watershed scale. It also exists at the land use scale at the local level. And where you have a large marsh complex that could take up flood risk and become a flood management tool, you also have commercial development that's important for the North Haven and the region that you have to take into consideration, as well as a train track on the western portion of this that has a regional scale function. So thinking about land use changes has to occur at multiple scales. Next slide. We came up with this concept that we call zones of shared risk. It basically identifies subpopulations in an area that share a similar risk. So you can see the SH, which stands for Sachem's Head. That's a neighborhood of about 130 homeowners who all have a chronic flood issue that once a month keeps them from accessing their property. If you look down at the bottom there, there's a small red zone. That's a repetitive flood loss set of houses there that often in towns becomes kind of the canary in the coal mine. The repetitive flood loss homes become the area where you get the highest complaints. But when you think about resiliency and prioritization, recognizing the 130 odd homes in Sachem's Head that have this chronic flood risk, that may take priority over these other issues. And ultimately, instead of working at the broader town scale, if you work at with the Sachem's Head subpopulation, you can identify a subpopulation that shares similar risks, and so you can start to negotiate and think about public and private negotiation strategies to deal with resilience planning. And that idea of zones of shared risk really is scaleless, so you can scale it up to the watershed scale, which basically works as a zone itself, down to pockets of homes and areas, for example, that are on the same sewage system. Next slide. And you can start to see how that idea of the resilience corridor here gets mapped onto a physical landscape where you have these zones or areas of drainage issue or marsh complexes or critical facilities, and you start to then take the theory and apply it to the geographic areas and towns. Next slide. So just to take this one step further and show the kind of complexity of prioritization and negotiating, within a town and the kind of resiliency planning that we're moving forward on at the site scale. I look at the South End in Stratford, here's a historic image showing showing Long Beach and the large wetland complex that makes up a portion of Stratford, as well as West Haven's Oldfield Creek on the bottom. Next slide. So you can think about how these areas in these two neighborhoods have evolved. And here's a flood map of 2012 Sandy over these two areas to show the impact of flooding that they experienced. Next slide. In West Haven, here's the 2012 Sandy flood risk, and you can see Oldfield Creek on the right. Next slide. And here's a look at the FEMA firm maps showing the potential extent of flooding with different category storm events. So you can see on the right where Oldfield Creek exists, there's kind of a peninsula of land. In the road running down the middle is what we might call a resilience corridor that has potential. So if you look at the next slide. Yep. Sorry, next slide. Oops, did it get stuck? There we go. We basically took the FEMA firm maps and worked with the town engineer, town planners to brainstorm about investment strategies. And you can see the box on the right is, it's okay, the critical facility, you can see here, is in red. So they have a sewage treatment plant that they need to, or are interested in establishing dry egress to. And the question is whether to raise the road adjacent to their critical facility, which is in red here, or to raise Second Avenue down the middle. The choices of what to raise has impacts on existing marshland, and it has impacts on housing property and potentially on housing value. In West Haven, it's interesting. These are predominantly rental units and some low to moderate income housing in the area. None of them have really raised, even though there have been flood issues. The area in green here is actually an area that was part of the first buyout program in Connecticut. So a number of homes, I believe 17, were negotiated through the town and bought out through the NDRC program at full value pre-Sandy. And they're going through a second phase of that program. So these were demolished and converted into green space. And but the houses around there haven't really raised and also have flood risk. And the question is, you could build a wall adjacent in the red zones that are shown here, raised road strategies or a wall. But you may also, that may cause, that takes away floodplain, and it could catalyze gentrification. And it's a complicated issue. So next slide. We identified well, I should mention that the road going across the marsh also has the main 36-inch pipe going out to the critical facility. So that's an example where you have a legacy infrastructure that requires, that would be costly to adapt. And so it becomes part of your resiliency planning measures. We identified a resiliency corridor down 2nd Avenue with branches that are tendrils that come out and have raised parking. But then we have a green street strategy that would allow the roads along the wetland to transition into floodable zones. Next slide. And you can see how we show this as an incremental set of steps for the town so that there can be an awareness of adaptation moves, and that so there can be a transitional strategy. And then if you look at the site plan long-term on the right, you can see how basically the investment in the resilience corridor creates connections down to parking areas along what became an expanded parkland. So it becomes a greenway that's expanded, that becomes a regional park, and people can essentially park in the raised parking area and get access to the coast, which is one of the issues that is a challenge along the Connecticut coast, is access to coastline. And meanwhile, the homeowners can make choices about raising their property and getting dry egress. Next slide. And my last example is in Stratford. Here's the 2012 Sandy flooding. You can see the Bridgeport, the Sikorsky Airport, which floods pretty heavily. And you can see the marsh complex. And if you look at the I-95 on the north, there's a roadway that is part of the economic development zone that goes across past the airport, and there's Lordship Island out that looks like an island that has basically 2 roads accessed that are fairly at risk. Next slide. Next slide. You can see how we communicated with the town around the flood risk and thinking about ways of establishing drainage and facilitating raised road strategies to manage the function of the town. Next slide. I should mention that the south end area that's in yellowish here with the green is a low to moderate income neighborhood that has real flood risks. Here's the town's POCD, the Plan of Conservation Development from 2014. Their employment growth district is essentially in an area that has extensive flood risk. And so there's a question about economic development strategies for the town and how they can move forward given the overlap of their employment growth district with their flood risk. Next slide. You can see on the left is the vulnerability and risk assessment from their coastal resilience plan showing the south end's floodable condition, Lordship Boulevard to the south. The airport is basically underwater in this context, given the 100-year flood event. And you can see their employment growth district again is proposed in that area. Now, part of the issue is that it's connected to I-95, so there's easy access, and they don't really have any other locations to establish the employment growth area. But you can see the conundrum with developing a resiliency plan for an area like this. Next slide. Yeah, next slide. This is the Coastal Community Resilience Plan 2016. that looks at ways of developing flood wall protection for the employment growth district and raised road strategies to address connections out to Lordship Boulevard, and a number of smaller scale projects to reinforce and to control for erosion issues along the coastal area. Next slide. Yeah. Sorry, the transition's taking a little while. And this is a map of the Stratford flood risk that looks at buildings in purple that face flood risk, and an alternative proposal to create paths of economic development, allow the neighborhood to become a green infrastructure neighborhood that could flood, and allow a hydrologic connectivity across that area of Stratford instead of raising roads on either side. So there's alternatives, and you can see the resilience corridor on the right-hand side. That investment corridor is something that they've already started to invest in with, they've done a 18-inch raising and expansion by the airport. They've done some, they have a pump system in certain areas where there's flooding. But one of the issues there is the airport creates height restrictions on road raising, which means that since there's only 2 egress routes out to Lordship, you can start to see the conundrums where you have critical facilities or land uses such as an airport in a low-lying area that floods, and an important resilience corridor or egress route that supports egress during storm events. These challenges are not simple, and site-specific analysis, technical analysis to understand the flood risks and to get very particular data on elevations and wave heights and frequencies are essential to start to inform decision-making on complicated problems and projects such as this. Next slide. And I'll just wrap up with a nod to the resilience corridor concept, the idea of having a framework that state officials agree on as a methodology. This framework served as a boundary object, a negotiating tool between the state as an investment and a negotiating strategy and municipalities interested in investing in egress routes. So it really served as a way to smooth the way for additional dialogue along practical solutions. Next slide. And CIRCA is taking that to the next level, thinking about the relationship between technical and planning strategies. Next slide. Bridging across the public, academia, private, and government officials. And go ahead and switch it. We see a critical role for the technical playing into planning decision-making because the complexity of these areas and the management strategies create challenges that require technical analysis. So next slide, please. Next slide. Yep. And so what CIRCA has been doing is developing as part of the Resilient Connecticut a whole series of methodologies that deal with modeling analysis, map viewers, the field research I mentioned, translating these technical issues to planning, establishing SLR projections, that's fine. And then we're really taking, establishing a draft resilient framework plan that is intended as a raising the bar or the threshold in terms of planning in the state of Connecticut. So building in technical analysis that can inform site scale, municipal scale to site scale planning efforts, and can develop typological conditions along the Connecticut coast, and can build on existing engineering practices in terms of resiliency planning, but also add levels of methodology and technical support to guide more practical integration of practical and innovative solutions for resiliency planning for the state. And I will wrap up there.
Great. Okay, so this is Rob from RPA, and I'm going to run through these pretty quick so we have some time for questions at the end. Really quick, I'm going to focus on planning for resilience and do, let's see, next slide. So, just really quickly, I'll just give you a sense of who we are so you know who we are and what we're doing, why I'm talking to you about this. A little bit of our fourth plan, and then I'll dig into very briefly a local planning exercise we did and what we've learned from it. Next slide. Okay, so if you don't know who Regional Plan Association is, we are a nonprofit independent organization, nearly 100 years old, and we essentially look at the region as a whole, the New York City metropolitan region, and try to determine how can we ensure the economic health, environmental sustainability, and quality of life for this region. And we do it through research, planning, and advocacy. Next slide. So we do this through regional plans. We put out a regional plan once a generation. We did one in the 20s, one in the 60s, one in the 90s, and then one just a year and a half ago we released in November of 2017. Next slide. That was our fourth regional plan. Next slide. And one of the things that was really important to this plan was the effects of climate change. It wasn't in any of our prior plans. It had a brief mention in our third plan, but so much has changed since that time. And the truth is, in doing the research for this plan, is we are a region of water. We have built in and around water. Next slide. In ways that kind of, the green here shows us where our historic wetlands were. And we have built into these floodplains and wetlands and all of the areas that today put us, next slide, at the front lines of climate change. Whether it's storm surge or sea level rise flooding or the increased intensity and frequency of storms, we are really facing risks that we hadn't faced before, and we've developed in the places that are at the front lines of this risk. Next slide. So I think, Yaprok did a great job of kind of demonstrating the risk of sea level rise. This is essentially what our region looks like at 1, 3, and 6 feet of sea level rise. And you can see that it kind of moves from more of a suburban issue at 1 foot of sea level rise to more of an urban issue affecting more people as we go on in time. Next slide. So, sea level rise is a risk by itself, but add it to the storms that we're facing, and clearly we're getting deeper and deeper reaches into the flooding that we face. Next slide. So our fourth plan focused on the flooding aspect of climate change through basically about three big level recommendations. We also did focus on the reduction of greenhouse gases, but that's something for another webinar. So, first we focused that there are going to be places that we will need to invest in protecting, whether it's our dense communities where we have a lot of people and infrastructure, and we're going to need to invest in these places. I thought Alex's slides did a good job of showing how it's going to differ for each community, and it's going to differ for each part of each different community. And I think that's the idea that we have here as well in our fourth plan, that we're going to need to invest in protecting some places for some reasons, and we're going to need to have good reasons to do that. Next slide. We're also going to need to transition away from places that cannot be protected. We cannot keep on rebuilding places that are going to continually face repetitive losses or that are not going to be able to keep out the water. Next slide. And we're going to need different governance and funding to do this. I like to say we're in the wild west of adaptation right now, and we're going to need to bring some order to it. And seeing what Alex presented is heartening because it shows a sense of order and opportunity for win-wins in this, but we're going to need both the governance and the funding to make this happen. Next slide. So next slide, in terms of planning locally, one thing that we've done is put together a climate adaptation network, something we were active with a year ago, but we're seeking funding to keep this going. But what this is a regional network of municipalities. The idea here is that we are going to need to share as much knowledge as we possibly can across boundaries. We're all taking different approaches. What Connecticut is proposing is a fantastic approach that I think could work in other places throughout the region. But we need the networks and the frameworks to do this and to have a kind of safe place for municipalities to share what they're going through with this. Adaptation is hard. It's going to require a difference in approaches. It's going to require funding. It's going to require creativity. And the more that we can share good examples like we're talking about today, the better off we're going to be as a region. Next slide. I'm going to skip over these next couple slides because I essentially gave you the sense of what this is. But check out our website, NYR, the New York Region can.org, and there are some webinars on there, not to compete with this webinar, hopefully only additive. And you can see some of the issues that we're discussing. Next slide. So I'd like to end with an example that I think really focuses on something that we haven't talked much about in this webinar, which is the importance of engagement with the people that we're talking about. We've looked at a lot of maps, a lot of great concepts and ideas, but the truth is there are people living in homes and there are businesses operating in these places that we're talking about. And it's really important that we find ways to engage with them, inform them, and help bring them into the decision-making process. So we did this in a project in Massac Beach, New York, which is on Long Island. And I chose this as an example because it's in some ways most like Connecticut, if you think of that barrier island as Long Island in Connecticut, and this community as on the Sound on Long Island. And it's got upland areas to move to if you wanted to, and it's got a train station that runs along up there. So Massac Beach, New York is a South Shore community on Long Island. It got hit hard by Sandy, and it faces this risk of permanent flooding from sea level rise moving forward. Next slide. So the importance here, the focus here is on engagement, and next slide is a similar picture. The idea here, what we did is we want to work with community members to get them out of the context of thinking about today. Adaptation is a kind of a transition. It's a phase over time, and we're going to need to do different things at different times as we move forward. We don't have to just kind of pull the Band-Aid off and move everybody today, but we need to have a plan in place to kind of get there. So what we did was ask people we created a game that we asked people to play, and we asked them to look basically the next 50 years or so into their future and consider what might happen over the time and what decision a municipality might want to make in that time. And it really gave people a sense of thinking beyond just their current living situation today to a future where they may not even be here, but they still want to know what happens to their community. And it really gave us an opportunity to kind of have people think differently. Next slide. So what came out of that process was essentially 3 different scenarios for Massac Beach, and some that kind of make win-wins happen, because I think that's what we're trying to find here with adaptation. With a tough concept, how do we find the win-wins? Obviously, the baseline is just letting it flood. The idea of a waterfront downtown where you invest in kind of keeping things the same, and then an environmental showcase. So really quickly, I'll run through these if you just kind of advance through. Next slide. That's the baseline. Next slide. So a waterfront downtown means you would invest in protecting, what people are drawn to, which is the waterfront, while making sure you make changes to kind of protect the rest of the community. Next slide. So what we show here is kind of investing in hills and berms to create a downtown at the waterfront. Next slide. And then you create a commercial waterfront. Next slide. And then you will need to invest in significant protection measures and pumping stations. This is the reality of kind of preserving economic development opportunities at the coastline. Next slide. And then you create a secondary downtown to kind of relate to that waterfront downtown. Next slide, and that's around the train station. And then you have to create zoning and redevelopment restrictions to reduce the risk. Next slide. Obviously, there are trade-offs with this. It's very costly, negative environmental impacts, all the things you need to think about as you kind of move forward with these adaptation plans. Next slide. Then there was the other idea that came out through working with people and asking them to consider this future was an environmental showcase. How do you make this place a natural haven for ecotourism? So the real focus here is kind of you densify the downtown that's out of the flood zone while creating, using buyout programs and restoration dollars to create a real ecotourism center for this town. You can just kind of flip through and people will see the features of this idea. Next slide. So you build up the downtown, you have light commercial, wetlands restoration, you need a buyout program, and then you create protection at the town level. Next slide. And you have vegetated islands, right? Next. And next slide. So, this is costly, creates a smaller town, things you have to think about as you kind of move forward with adaptation. You're going to lose revenue, but how do you make sure you create revenue in other places? Like that densified downtown, and use opportunities to be experimental with the ecotourism ideas. Next slide. going. So, the idea is that we need to be thinking about these decision points as we create these ideas. What needs to happen when? The most important thing that we need to have here is a plan going forward. And crucial to that plan going forward are what are the resources that are going to help you get there. So if you kind of engage the community, figure out when you need to make these decisions, and then kind of move forward to make these both difficult decisions but possibly opportune decisions, and have the funding in there and the governance there to kind of back it up, we have a chance to make adaptation as painless as possible and kind of create it in ways that create economic opportunities as well. Next slide. So, just a kind of final thought on this is, we asked, one other way to get people out of the context of today was to ask them to, once they had these different scenarios in front of them, write postcards from the future, from that point today. It's really important to get people thinking about, what this future looks like and how to create it in a good way. So this exercise was really, I think, exciting and good to kind of show that people can break out of the context of today and think ahead to the future and see some positives in it. So final slide, next. So, a lot of things we've learned as we've kind of developed our fourth plan, work with communities and all of this. So these are just a few of the things. We do need to share approaches. Again, this is a tough time. We're going to be making some important decisions, and as Connecticut has success with this corridor approach, we should share it with New Jersey and New York and other communities across the country. We need to have the common science driving us. What Yaprak started with is what everyone needs to be working from the same book, essentially. Funding is critical to make this happen, and planning ahead is key. We need to hit those timelines and hit those decision points. But there are reservations about regional governance. As a regional organization, we believe that a regional approach is going to work best. There are certain things that we can figure out at a regional level. But individual municipalities are kind of not for those ideas as much. So we're going to need to find ways to kind of dissolve the boundaries as we plan for adaptation, even while keeping kind of local decision making in place. So that's it. Hopefully we have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks so much to all of our presenters today. So we'll now take questions. I think we probably only have time for maybe 2 questions, if you all don't mind just staying on for maybe a couple extra minutes. Here's one question that we have. Yaprak briefly mentioned the impacts of rising sea level for communities inland. Are there specific impacts that communities could expect beyond the broader state impacts of changes to the shoreline?
So if you think about just like the climate change perspective, yes, in the inland, the temperature changes, the precipitation changes is going to reflect more river flooding. So that's going to affect in the inland too. Sea level rise effect mostly going to be impacted during the coastal towns, but as CIRCA, we are actually conducting storm surge and then sea level rise impact modeling that's not only just impact the coastal towns but also integrate the rivers, like how it's going to flood along the rivers too. So in the inland, mostly you're going to see it that way. And another way that you can see the sea level rise effect, if we just talk about it, how the ground water level contamination is going to happen too. So yeah, we cannot just say that you're fully safe in inland, but you're relatively safe, but there's always a risk.
Thanks, Yaprak. One last question. At this stage, it is difficult to tell the jurisdictional issues like town versus state versus federal ownership. What level of thought have you given to the funding and public finance mechanics for implementing these plans over the short and long term?
Rob, do you want to try to answer that?
I mean, I can answer. I don't know. I'll be curious to hear what the state is thinking about that. But I mean, I think the idea that we found is that there are so many different pots of funding. We believe at RPA that there needs to be a dedicated fund for adaptation. With the amount of infrastructure we're going to need to invest in, the buyouts we're going to need to do, the protection we're going to need to do, there's going to need to be a dedicated source of funding for this. And you know, to manage a dedicated source of funding, we're going to have probably some kind of governance in place to do that crosses boundaries, that creates criteria and design standards. I am curious to hear how Connecticut's aiming to implement the corridor plan.
Yeah, so I guess from our perspective, one of the key steps is to think about prioritization. So to help towns think about how to prioritize investment strategies. A second is to think about how to add technical analysis to existing documents to help shift them into the realm to get them up to the threshold of getting, Army Corps, FEMA, other kinds of funding. So that's a second step. We're also interested in trying to embed resiliency strategies into existing operations and management, as well as capital projects, so that the choices being made for existing choices being made by towns for construction projects, et cetera, have a resiliency component to them, linking some of the coastal resilience planning to the plans of conservation development, for example, and the hazard mitigation planning, and tying those all together. In terms of the large moves, that are the very costly large moves, I think that is something that we see as incremental. We think that, or we hope to develop some strategies that have a combined public investment and private investment strategy embedded in them, or to start to develop pilot projects that have those kind of components. But I think Rob is right that the cost implications of resiliency are large, and the funding sources are not there.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex and Rob. So thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Thanks for staying on the line, even though we went a little bit late. As a reminder, for anyone looking to receive CM credits, please look for the 2-question survey that should pop up immediately after this webinar is ended, and be sure that you fill it out. Also, look for the webinar recording and program evaluation survey in your email later today. Thanks, everybody, and have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you.